with my colleague, Senator Risch. In 2012, we went to Georgia to observe officially, on behalf of the Senate, the election between outgoing President Mikhail Saakashvili and his United National Movement Party, and the challenge by Georgian Dream, which was a newly formed party supported and funded by billionaire oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili. It was a battle for parliament, but also for control of the government. Senator Risch and I visited multiple polling places on Election Day, and we agreed with the international assessment that that election was free and fair and that Georgian Dream were the winners. But there was real concern in the country that Saakashvili was going to refuse to give up power, that would lead to violence, it would end the nascent democratic reforms that were happening in that former Soviet republic. And so Senator Risch and I, the day after the election, went to visit President Saakashvili to try and talk him out of staying in power. And I remember very clearly going to his home, and we sat down with him and we pointed out that the hallmark of a democracy, what he had worked so hard for in his 8 years as president of Georgia, the hallmark of that was to turn over power in a peaceful election to the person that the voters chose. Well, President Saakashvili listened to us, and he did leave office peacefully. But it's important that future generations recognize that America, like democracies everywhere, depends on a peaceful transition of power, on believing in what the voters say and in ensuring that happens. Unfortunately, we've heard from some senators today who have been enabling President Trump's willful disregard of the votes of our citizenry, even as they speak out against foreign leaders who ignore their own people. They will fail, and history will remember them. And I hope that future generations will view the actions of some of those folks today as little more than an unfortunate anomaly. Future opportunists may use this ill-fated effort to seek short-term political gain over the long-term stability of our republic. But for the sake of our great country and America's standing in the world, I ask my colleagues today to fully endorse the results of the free and fair election and set aside this partisan attempt to subvert the will of the people. We should be venerating the peaceful transition of power, even if our own preferred candidate didn't win. That is, after all, who we are in the United States of America. Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I yield up to 5 minutes to the Senator from Ohio, Senator Portman.
Senator from Ohio.
Mr. Vice President, you have fulfilled your duties as President of the Senate tonight with distinction, and we all appreciate it. I thought about changing my mind and not speaking tonight, given the lateness of the hour, and I know all of my colleagues would have appreciated that greatly. But I felt it was necessary to speak because I want the American people, particularly my constituents in Ohio, to see that we will not be intimidated, that we will not be disrupted from our work, that here in the citadel of democracy, we will continue to do the work of the people. Mob rule is not going to prevail here. Now, let's face it, we did not reclaim this chamber tonight. Brave and selfless law enforcement officers stood in the breach and ensured that the citadel of democracy would be protected and that we would be defended. And we are deeply grateful for that, as is the nation. I've listened carefully to the comments of my colleagues, and I've listened over the past couple of weeks as this issue has been discussed, and I tell you, for me, it's not a hard decision. I stand with the Constitution. I stand with what the Constitution makes clear. The people and the states hold the power here, not us. My oath to the Constitution and my reverence for our democratic principles make it easy for me to confirm these state certifications. By the way, I posed this process some 15 years ago when some Democrats chose to object to the electors from my home state of Ohio after the 2004 elections. I opposed it then, and I oppose it now. I said at the time, Congress must not thwart the will of the people. That's what we would be doing. Let's assume for a moment that those who object to the certifications are right, that the Constitution intended that a bare majority of members of Congress could circumvent the states that have chosen to certify the popular votes of their own state citizens. I ask the objectors to think about the precedent that would be set if we were to do that. What if the majority in the House and the Senate was of the other party when a presidential candidate of our party came through a close presidential election? Would you want a Congress controlled by the Democrats to play the role you now intend for us? It is asking Congress to substitute its judgment for the judgment of the voters, and its judgment for the judgment of the states that certified the results. And even forgetting the dangerous precedent that would be set, what would be the basis for objecting in this election? Look, I voted for President Trump. I supported him because I believe the Trump administration's policies are better for Ohio and for the country. And I supported the Trump campaign's right to pursue recounts. They had every right to do it. And legal challenges. I agree that there were instances of fraud and irregularities in the 2020 elections. I think we all do. And by the way, there is fraud and irregularities in every presidential election. But it is also true that after 2 months of recounts and legal challenges, not a single state recount changed the result. And of the dozens of lawsuits filed, not one found evidence of fraud or irregularities widespread enough to change the result of the election. This was the finding of numerous Republican-appointed judges and the Trump administration's own Department of Justice. Every state has now weighed in and chosen to certify its electoral slate based on the popular vote as set out in the Constitution. I understand that many Americans who would never storm this Capitol don't trust the integrity of the 2020 election. Don't think the states should have certified. Don't think we should have accepted the results from the states and are insisting on more transparency and accountability. In the 2016 elections, lest we forget, many Democrats objected to the results and distrusted the election. I challenge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to listen, but also to do our part to try to restore faith in our elections. Mr. President, we should all work to improve the integrity of the electoral system and the confidence of the American people in this bedrock of our great democratic republic. Today, I'll do my constitutional duty and oppose these efforts to reject the state-certified results. And tomorrow, in the wake of this attack on the Capitol, the pandemic that engulfs us, and other national challenges, let's work together for the people. Yield back.
Democratically.
Leader.
Mr. President, I believe we have 8 minutes left, so I'd like to divide 4. Four to Senator King and 4 to Senator Van Hollen.
That's correct, Leader.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, Winston Churchill once said that he could do a 2-hour speech extemporaneously, but a 10 minute speech took immense preparation. I don't know what he would have said about a 4-minute speech. We are a 240-year anomaly in world history. We think that what we have here in this country is the way it's always been. It is a very unusual form of government. The normal form of government throughout world history is dictators, kings, czars, pharaohs, warlords, tyrants. And we thought 20 years ago the march of history was toward democracy, but it is in retreat in Hungary and Turkey. Goodness knows in Russia. Democracy as we have practiced it is fragile. It's fragile and it rests upon trust. It rests upon trust in facts. It rests upon trust in courts, in public officials, and yes, in elections. I don't sympathize or justify or in any way support, that's putting it mildly, what happened here today, but I understand it. I understand it because I saw those people interviewed today and they said, we're here because this election has been stolen. And the reason they said that is that their leader has been telling them that every day for 2 months. We cannot afford to pull bricks out from the foundation of trust that underlies our entire system. And I agree with Governor Romney that the answer to this problem is to tell people the truth, is to tell them what happened. It's easy to confront your opponents. It's hard to confront your friends. It's hard to tell your supporters something they don't want to hear. But that's our obligation. That's why the word leader is applied to people in jobs like ours. It's not supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be something that we take on as a sacred obligation. And if people believe something that isn't true, it's our obligation to tell them, no, I'm sorry, it isn't. Just as Senator Portman just said, as Mike Lee just said, I'm sorry, we can't do this here. We don't want to do this here. This is a power reserved to the states, not to the Congress. And I agree with the majority leader. I think this is one of the most important votes any of us will ever take. On December 1st, 1862, Abraham Lincoln came to this building. He came to this building in the darkest days of the Civil War. He was trying to awaken the Congress to the crisis that we were facing. And he didn't feel that they were fully and effectively engaged. And he ended his speech that day with words that I think have an eerie relevance tonight. Here's what Abraham Lincoln said. Fellow Americans, we cannot escape history. We of this Congress and this administration will be remembered in spite of ourselves. No personal significance or insignificance can spare one or another of us. And here's his final words. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. The mob violence and attack we saw on our Capitol today should be a wake-up call to each and every one of us of what happens when we fail to come together, not as Democrats and Republicans, but each of us as Americans, to stand up to a president who time and again has shown contempt for our democracy, contempt for our Constitution. Today, here on the Capitol, we witnessed people taking down an American flag and putting up a Trump flag. That is not democracy in the United States of America. As every senator who has spoken has mentioned, we have for hundreds of years had a peaceful transfer of power. Nobody likes to lose, and supporters of the losing candidate are always disappointed. What's different this time? We all know what's different this time. We had a president who, as a senator from New Jersey, said even before a vote was cast, that if he didn't win the election, it was going to be a fraud. And every day since then has perpetrated that lie. We have a president who just today criticized very loyal vice president who is presiding right now, urging him to disregard his responsibilities under the Constitution of the United States in order to reinstall Donald Trump as president. The same person who got on the phone to the Secretary of State in Georgia and threatened him to change the results of the election. Mr. President, I read something this week I'd never thought I'd read in a newspaper in the United States of America. It was an op-ed by all the living former secretaries of defense, including Secretaries Rumsfeld, Cheney, and Mattis, warning the country about our tradition of peaceful transfer of power and that it would be inappropriate for the military to take sides. In the United States of America, we talk to the world about how we want to promote democracy and our values, and right here at home, too many are undermining those values. And Mr. President, Donald Trump could not do this alone. He can only do it if he's aided and abetted by individuals who are willing to perpetrate those lies and those conspiracies. And that is why it is so important that we as Democrats and Republicans and senators stand up together. Stand up together and tell the truth. You know, when you go into a court of law like those 60 cases, you're testifying under penalty of perjury. That's very different than here in the House and the Senate. And in all those 60 cases under penalty of perjury, there was no evidence of widespread fraud. So it should be easy for us all together to tell the truth. On January 20th, Joe Biden will be sworn in as the next president of the United States. He has said he wants to bring the country together. He has said he wants to bring Democrats and Republicans together to do some of the pressing business of this country, to defeat this pandemic, to get the economy going again, to face challenging issues of racial and social justice. I hope we will learn from what happened today, the mob attack on this Capitol, the price we pay when we don't stand up for the truth and for democracy. James McHenry, Maryland's delegate to the Constitutional Convention, wrote about a famous exchange in his diaries between Elizabeth Willing Powell and Benjamin Franklin. Wrote, a lady asked Dr. Franklin, well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy? A republic, replied Dr. Franklin, if you can keep it. My colleagues, this is a test of whether we're united to keep our republic. I hope we will pass the test together. Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I yield up to 5 minutes to the Senator from South Carolina, Senator Graham.
Senator from South Carolina.
Many times my state has been the problem. I love it. It's where I want to die, but no time soon. Tim and I have a good relationship. I love Tim Scott. 1876, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida sent two slate of electors. They had two governments, by the way, and we didn't know what to do. Why did South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana do it? To hold the country hostage to end Reconstruction. It worked. The commission was 8-7. It didn't work. Nobody accepted it. The way it ended is when Hayes did a deal with these 3 states. You give me the electors, I'll kick the Union Army out. The rest is history. It led to Jim Crow. If you're looking for historical guidance, this is not the one to pick. If you're looking for a way to convince people there was no fraud, having a commission chosen by Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, and John Roberts is not going to get you to where you want to go. It ain't going to work. So it's not going to do any good. It's going to delay, and it gives credibility to a dark chapter of our history. That's why I'm not with you. But I will fight to my death for you. You're able to object. You're not doing anything wrong. Other people have objected. I just think it's a uniquely bad idea to delay this election. Trump and I, we've had a hell of a journey. I hate it to end this way. Oh my God, I hate it. From my point of view, he's been a consequential president. But today, first thing you'll see. All I can say is count me out. Enough is enough. I've tried to be helpful. But when the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled 4-3 that they didn't violate the Constitution of Wisconsin, I agree with the 3, but I accept the 4. If Al Gore can accept 5-4, he's not president. I can accept Wisconsin 4-3. Pennsylvania, it went to the Second Circuit. So much for all the judges being in Trump's pocket. They said, no, you're wrong. I accept the Pennsylvania Second Circuit that Trump's lawsuit wasn't right. Georgia, they said the Secretary of State took the law in his own hands. He changed the election laws unlawfully. A federal judge said, no, I accept the federal judge even though I don't agree with it. Fraud. They said there's 66,000 people in Georgia under 18 voted. How many people believe that? I asked, give me 10. I hadn't had one. They said 8,000 felons in prison in Arizona voted. Give me 10. I hadn't gotten one. Does that say there's problems in every election? I don't buy this. Enough's enough. We got to end it. Vice President Pence, what they're asking you to do, you won't do because you can't. You talk about interesting times. I associate myself with Rand Paul. How many times will you hear that? The mob has done something nobody else could do to get me and Rand to agree. Rand is right. If you're a conservative, this is the most offensive concept in the world, that a single person could disenfranchise 155 million people. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and the House of Representatives, open all certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be president. Where in there does it say Mike can say, I don't like the results? I want to send them back to the states. I believe there was fraud. To the conservatives who believe in the Constitution, now's your chance to stand up and be counted. Originalism, count me in. It means what it says. So, Mike, Mr. Vice President, just hang in there. They said we can count on Mike. All of us can count on the Vice President. You're going to do the right thing. You're going to do the constitutional thing. You got a son who flies F-35s. You got a son-in-law who flies F-18s. They're out there flying so that we can get it right here. There are people dying, to my good friend from Illinois, to make sure we have a chance to argue among ourselves. And when it's over, it is over. It is over. The final thing, Joe Biden. I've traveled the world with Joe. I hoped he lost. I prayed he would lose. He won. He's the legitimate president of the United States. I cannot convince people, certain groups, by my words, but I will tell you by my actions that maybe I, above all others in this body, need to say this. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are lawfully elected and will become the president and the Vice President of the United States on January the 20th.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I yield back the balance of our time.
All time has expired. The question is, shall the objection submitted by the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, and the senator from Texas, Mr. Cruz, and others be sustained? Is there a second? There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. No. Mr. Barrasso. No. Mr. Bennett. No. Mrs. Blackburn. No. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blunt. No. Mr. Booker. No. Mr. Bozeman. No. Mr. Braun. No. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Burr. No. Ms. Cantwell. No. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. No. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. No. Mr. Cassidy. No. Ms. Collins. No. Mr. Coons. No. Mr. Cornyn. No. Ms. Cortez Masto. No. Mr. Cotton. No. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. No. Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Daines. No. Ms. Duckworth. No. Mr. Durbin. No. Ms. Ernst. No. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. No. Mrs. Gillibrand. No. Mr. Graham.
No.
Mr. Grassley.
No.
Mr. Haggerty.
No.
Ms. Harris. No. Ms. Hassan. No. Mr. Holy. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. No. Mr. Hoven. I got excited. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe.
No.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane.
No.
Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. Kennedy.
Aye.
Mr. King. No. Ms. Klobuchar.
No.
Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee.
No.
Mrs. Loeffler.
These are all...
Mr. Lujan.
No.
Ms. Lummis.
No.
Mr. Manchin.
No.
Mr. Markey.
No.
Mr. Marshall.
Aye.
Mr. McConnell.
No.
Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
On this vote, the yeas are 6, the nays are 93. The objection is not sustained. The Secretary will notify the House of the action of the Senate, informing that body that the Senate is now ready to proceed to joint session with further counting of the electoral vote for President and Vice President. Majority Leader.
Mr. President. So, colleagues, here's where we are. We have a few more speakers now as we wait for the House to finish their debate and vote. We expect the House to finish voting on Arizona between 11:30 and midnight. I ask unanimous consent the Senate be in a period of morning business with the following senators permitted to speak therein for up to 5 minutes each: Senator Toomey, Senator Rubio, Senator Collins.
And on our side, Senators Wyden, Hirono, and Coons.
Finally, following their remarks, the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
No.
Maybe not. Maybe not. We may have. Okay, so we'll figure it out.
Without objection, the Senate will be in morning business.
The Senate be in a period of morning business with the following senators permitted to speak therein for up to 5 minutes each: Toomey, Rubio, Collins.
Wyden, Hirono, and Coons.
Without objection.
Not many will.
Is this isn't yours, right? Got it.
So we're in recent.
Registered this election than any other party. I am proud that many of our tribal, rural, and underserved communities voted in record numbers, all during a pandemic. In 2020, Arizona's made their voices heard. The fact is, multiple federal, state judges, agencies, state elected officials concluded the winner was Joe Biden. In Arizona, this process was administered and overseen by officials from both parties. Elections officials conducted random, hand-counted audits of many precincts. They confirmed there were no errors that would change the result of the election. The fact is that the Republican chairman of Maricopa County, the largest Republican county in the state, the biggest population county, he stated more than 2 million ballots were cast, and there was no evidence of fraud or misconduct or malfunction. He concluded, no matter how you voted, this election was administered with integrity, transparency, and in accordance with state laws. The fact is, the president and his campaign and several Republican-led groups filed 8 election lawsuits, all of which were dismissed. The Arizona Supreme Court, a body where all justices have been appointed by Republican governors, unanimously dismissed the case. The justices found that the party had failed to present any evidence of misconduct or illegal votes, let alone establish any degree of fraud or a significant error rate that would undermine the certainty of the election results. After these judicial rulings, the governor said, "I trust our election system. There's integrity in our election system." The fact is, Joe Biden is the certified winner of Arizona's 11 electoral votes. Arizona's elected and appointed officials from both parties followed the facts and came to this conclusion. I urge my colleagues to do the same. To my colleagues across the aisle, I know we may disagree on who we want as president, but what we personally want is not what matters here. Rather, the people's influence, as reflected in the certified Electoral College results, is what matters. Facts matter. Undermining faith in our election process by attempting to mislead the American public
it would overturn the results
us
of the presidential election in Pennsylvania, and it would thereby deny Pennsylvania's voters the opportunity to even participate in the presidential election. Mr. President, even if Congress did have the constitutional responsibility to judge the worthiness of a state's election process, which it does not, rejecting Pennsylvania's electoral votes would still be wildly out of proportion to the purported offenses and very damaging to our republic. Let me go through a few facts about Pennsylvania. First, some of the objectors, and in fact even the President of the United States this morning, have observed that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court disregarded existing law when it ruled that mail-in ballots could be counted even if they arrived up to 3 days after the election day. Now, the objectors are right about that. In my view, the Supreme Court of the United States should overturn that illegal decision. But, Mr. President, only 10,097 ballots arrived in Pennsylvania during the 3 days after the election. And those 10,097 ballots have been excluded from the vote count that resulted in President-elect Biden winning Pennsylvania by about 80,000 votes. What greater remedy could the objectors possibly want than the complete exclusion of the late arriving ballots? How could we possibly invalidate the entire Pennsylvania election over 10,000 votes that were not even included in the vote count? A second charge we heard, and the senator from Missouri alluded to it this evening, is a 2019 Pennsylvania law that allows mail-in ballots for any reason, that might violate the Pennsylvania Constitution. Well, first of all, as Senator Casey observed, this was a bipartisan law passed with nearly unanimous Republican support. Clearly, the state legislators and the governor believe it is consistent with the Pennsylvania Constitution. Secondly, this law was not challenged when it was passed. It wasn't challenged when it was applied during the June primary election. It was only challenged after President Trump lost the general election. But 2.6 million Pennsylvanians voted by mail-in ballot in the general election. Over 37% of Pennsylvania voters in good faith relied on a law to cast their votes as they had done previously. Now, I understand you can make a theoretical argument about whether this is consistent with Pennsylvania's Constitution, and that needs to be resolved for future elections. But because of this constitutional question that some people have, the objectors want to prevent Pennsylvania voters from participating in the presidential election entirely. That would be an outrageous remedy to this purported offense. A third charge we've heard is that Pennsylvania officials did not properly implement Pennsylvania election law in a variety of other ways. But the Trump campaign has shown that many of these issues have, well, first of all, none of these issues would have changed the election outcome, but more importantly, the campaign had many opportunities of which it availed itself to litigate these issues. They did time and again, and they lost repeatedly, often in unanimous bipartisan decisions. Now, some of the objectors also cite Congress's own failure to investigate allegations of election irregularities, and that's their justification for refusing to certify the election results. But the allegations of election irregularities and fraud have been investigated. They've been adjudicated. They were adjudicated in the states in which they're alleged to have occurred. Now, in Pennsylvania, the Trump campaign took their case of election irregularities into the courtroom of Judge Matthew Brann of the Federal District Court. Judge Brann is a conservative Republican Federalist Society member. And here's what he said about the Trump campaign case, and I quote, "This court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations unsupported by evidence. In the United States of America, this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of the sixth most populated state." End quote. So the campaign then appealed Judge Brand's decision to the Third Circuit, and they drew a 3-judge panel, all Republican appointed judges, one appointed by President Trump. The panel concurred with Judge Brand. Mr. President, certainly there were irregularities in this election. There always are. But there's no evidence of significant fraud, conspiracies, or even significant anomalies that cast any serious doubt on who actually won the election. And you know, one of the ways you can tell is look at the big picture in Pennsylvania. Look at what happened. In 2016, President Trump won Pennsylvania by 0.8%. In 2020, he lost Pennsylvania by a little over 1%. Now, is there anything at all that's implausible or surprising about a 2% change in the election outcome? Relative to 2016, in Pennsylvania, the president lost a little ground in most of the rural counties he had carried. He lost a lot of ground in the big suburban counties, and he slightly narrowed his large loss in Philadelphia. There's no surprises here. This reflects a pattern that occurred all across the country. My colleagues, as I've said, it is not our responsibility to sit in judgment of state election procedures in the first place. But if it were, there would not be nearly sufficient reason to deny my constituents their right to participate in this presidential election. Mr. President, Joe Biden won the election. That's not what I had hoped for, but that's what happened. It was an honest victory, with the usual minor irregularities that occur in most elections. We witnessed today the damage that can result when men in power and responsibility refuse to acknowledge the truth. We saw bloodshed because the demagogue chose to spread falsehoods and sow distrust of his own fellow Americans. Let's not abet such deception. Let's reject this motion.
Mr. President, with just a few minutes to speak, I'm going to get right to the point. Gunfire in the halls here, IEDs on the Capitol grounds. I will say to my colleagues, I've been stunned that with the domestic terrorists roaming the halls just a few hours ago, I've been stunned that this debate is actually going forward. And that's because, colleagues, this is a fake debate on electoral certification. That's because it lends credibility to the bogus idea that the Congress can actually toss out the results of the election. And as we saw today, it serves to fuel insurrection. Now, contrary to what some of my I-voting colleagues believe, with I-votes cast just a few minutes ago, this debate has never been about setting up some kind of routine election tribunal. This isn't about election security. If the Republican majority for the last 2 years had actually been interested in election security, they would not have worked relentlessly to block my legislation to secure our 2020 elections with hand-marked paper ballots and post-election security audits. By the way, those are the kinds of approaches that are part of the Oregon system, where for 25 years we voted by mail. I'm the nation's first mail-in United States Senator. The second, and I see my colleagues from Maine and Alaska here because they're very fond of him like I was, Gordon Smith, a Republican, was the second mail-in United States Senator in our country. That's because we do the job right. It's efficient. Our late Republican Secretary of State, Dennis Richardson, actually told President Trump there was no evidence of fraud. So if Republicans had been interested over the last 2 years in actually working with me and colleagues on both sides of the aisle and secretaries of state, we could have had an approach that would have empowered the Oregon idea to go national. Instead, we're now debating tonight the idea of a discussion grounded in total fiction, brewed in cauldrons of conspiracies online. These, colleagues, are fever dreams laundered by people with election certificates and real power. And I will tell you, it's been painful to watch colleagues sidle up to some of those conspiracies that would inflict so much damage to the American experiment. Colleagues, I'm going to close with one last point. We saw today an effort by domestic terrorists to try to punch our democracy to the ground, to the ropes. And I'm going to close by simply saying something that hadn't been said tonight, and that is Donald Trump can do enormous damage to our country in the next 2 weeks. In the next 2 weeks, colleagues, Donald Trump can do enormous damage to our wonderful country. This afternoon, I don't know if my colleagues saw it, the National Association of Requested pursuant to Section 3S of House Resolution 8,
The yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device and are to remind it to
manufacturers, another organization without a left-wing outfit. They called for moving forward with the 25th Amendment. All over the news already, colleagues, this afternoon, the National Association of Manufacturers. That's what we're seeing in our country with respect to the fear of Americans having watched what happened here. So I'm just going to close by way of saying, I believe that for the next 2 weeks, we have an enormous responsibility to watchdog Donald Trump day in and day out, to do everything possible to prevent the kind of abuses that we saw today, where an American lost her life. And we saw the fear among our citizens at what went on. Let's do everything we can as leaders, Democrats and Republicans, to make sure in the next 2 weeks Donald Trump's abuses are checked. We do everything we can to protect this wonderful nation of ours. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Florida is recognized.
Mr. President, over the last weeks and days leading up to this vote here today, I've heard from a lot of people about this vote, and I guess I want to address it as much to them as anybody else. And these are people that I know. These are friends. These are neighbors. These are longtime supporters, generally people on my side of the political aisle. And they're upset. They're upset. They look at the media, and the media, they feel censored stories that might have been negative towards Joe Biden or were negative towards Joe Biden. The social media companies helped them out. And they saw how some states tinkered with and even mutilated state election laws. And they have doubts that the election was legitimate. And it gives this country this extraordinary crisis of confidence, which is very dangerous because democracy is very fragile and it's not held together by elections. Democracy is held together by people's confidence in the election and their willingness to abide by its results. And so the notion was, we need to do something, we need to fight. And several of my colleagues have adopted the idea, and I respect it, that they're going to object. Now listen, it's important to understand something. Even the people objecting in the Senate recognize that it's not going to pass. It's not going to change the outcome, but it's going to send a message. And it's going to make a point. The problem is, I think it's a terrible idea at this moment. Just hours ago, a young lady died in this Capitol. That means somebody somewhere in this country got a phone call that their daughter was dead. Daughter was going to a political rally, she is dead. Died in this Capitol, somewhere not far from where we are standing. We had police officers, the men and women that we walk by every single day that guard the doors and we say hello to, out there with riot gear getting spit on and attacked. Today, not 10 weeks ago, just a few hours ago. And I think it's important to think about all those things on a night like tonight and everything that's happened. You know, I wouldn't even be here today. I doubt very much where I would even have been interested in politics had it not been for my grandfather. He died when I was 14, but I grew up at his knee. He would sit on the porch, he would smoke 3 cigars a day, and he loved history. He was born in 1899 in rural Cuba. It was still governed by the United States. It was a protectorate. 3 years later, it gained its independence and became a republic. During my grandfather's first 60 years of life, he saw his country have an armed insurrection after a contested election, multiple presidents go into exile, 2 military coups, and the rise of a Marxist dictator. A tyranny that stands to this day. My entire life, I have lived with and next to people who came to America because their country was chaotic and their country was unsafe. What I saw today, what we have seen, looks more like those countries than the extraordinary nation that I am privileged to call home. And I think about the mockery that it makes of our country. A lot of people, oh, well, China. No, let me just say something. In all modesty, no one here has worked harder on the issue of China. They hate my guts. I'm sanctioned, twice sanctioned. I don't know what they're sanctioning, double sanctioned, and I can't travel there. I wasn't planning to anyway. China's laughing. They're loving this tonight. In Beijing, they're high-fiving because they point to this and say, this is proof. The future belongs to China. America's in decline. Vladimir Putin, there's nothing Vladimir Putin could have come up with better than what happened here. Makes us look like we're in total chaos and collapse. Not to mention the Ayatollah, who's probably bragging, if he has buddies, to his buddies, look what's happening to the great Satan. I think politics has made us crazy. Everybody in this country has lost their minds on politics. And we have forgotten that America is not a government. America's not a president. America's not a Congress. Let me tell you what America is. America's your family. America's your faith. America's your community. That's America. That's what our adversaries don't understand, and that's what we need to remember. That is how we're going to rebuild this country and turn the page and have a future even brighter than our past. And so that's why I feel so strongly about this, and why I hope those who disagree with me will understand. I yield the floor.
The senator from Hawaii is recognized.
Mr. President, it has been hard at times to find the words to describe the full harm Donald Trump has inflicted on our country. We can spend hours dissecting how his policies have made us less safe, less healthy, but his presidency has also been a profound moral failure. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, a father from Hawaii joined me at one of my talk story sessions in my office, and he asked me a question that struck me hard at that time and has stuck with me until today. He said, "How can I tell my son that lying is not okay when the President of the United States lies every single day?" I struggled to answer his question then, and I'm not sure I could offer an adequate answer now. But this conversation remains a clear example of how we do not live in normal times. How is it normal as we and the world watched in horror as an angry mob stormed the United States Capitol? Blood was shed, people were hurt, vandalism occurred. It is not normal when we have a president who lies every single day. And even in the face of this vandalism, this mob, he really doesn't have much to say except, "I love you, you should go home now." It's not normal when in the middle of a pandemic that has claimed the lives of over 350,000 Americans, which is nearly the combined population of the islands of Maui and the Big Island, we have a president who only seems to care about spreading conspiracies to undermine confidence in our elections and our democracy. And it's not normal when duly elected senators who took an oath to uphold the Constitution pull a stunt to try and nullify millions of votes in 6 states so that Donald Trump can remain president. I call this effort a stunt because it is doomed to fail. We have a strong bipartisan majority, as noted in the vote that we just took, in both chambers of Congress who reject this stunt. And courts have ruled against Trump and his allies in more than 60 cases. So whenever this farce ends, the result will be the same. Donald Trump will have lost the election, and Joe Biden will become the 46th president of the United States. You can tell a lot about a person from the way they handle defeat. The way Donald Trump has handled defeat says a lot about who he is. Watching so many of our colleagues indulge the president tells us a lot about them, too. We don't have to look back very far in history to find examples of candidates who lost tough races but demonstrated their character in defeat. Our colleague, Senator Romney, graciously conceded his defeat to President Obama in noting that, quote, at a time like this, we can't risk partisan bickering and political posturing. Our leaders have to reach across the aisle to do the people's work, and we citizens also have to rise to the occasion. And in 2000, during an election with substantial irregularities and partisan intervention from the Supreme Court, Al Gore nevertheless put his country first, and he said, "Let there be no doubt that while I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession." As I reflect on the service of these distinguished public servants and the acts they took to maintain our democracy, I'm also drawn to remarks President Obama made 4 years ago in his farewell address to the nation when he warned that our democracy is threatened whenever we take it for granted. It is a particularly sage warning as we contend with the President of the United States seeking to nullify a free and fair election simply because he lost. We have to stand up, speak out, and fight back because our democracy itself is at stake. American democracy has endured over the centuries in large part because our institutions serve as guardrails to keep us from going over the cliff. As elected officials, we can strengthen these guardrails by listening to our own conscience in moments of peril, by having what our friend John Lewis called an executive session with myself. Before making a big decision, John would say, "Listen, self, this is what you must do. This is where you must go." Today, we can follow John's example. Listen to our conscience. Stand up for our Constitution and do what's right. I yield the floor.
The senator from Maine's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me begin my remarks tonight by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to the members of the law enforcement community and the National Guard, whose hard work and courage made it possible for us to resume our deliberations tonight. We return to this chamber tonight undeterred by the violence we witnessed and strengthened in our determination to fulfill our constitutional duty. Mr. President, the Constitution is the foundation of our American democracy, and the Constitution is what must guide our decisions on the presidential election. The process the Constitution sets forth for electing presidents through the Electoral College is straightforward. The people vote. Electors are chosen. The electors vote. Then Congress counts the electors' votes. That final step in the process is why we have convened today. Counting the votes of the electors, a function that the 12th Amendment assigns to Congress, is an administrative and largely ceremonial act. Our job is simply to count the votes certified by each state, nothing more. We should not attempt to usurp the roles of the voters, the states, or the Electoral College. Mr. President, the American people have done their job, turning out in record numbers to vote in the midst of a frightening pandemic. Indeed, as a percentage of the voting eligible population, the turnout was the highest in 120 years. Similarly, in the midst of this pandemic, hundreds of election officials and volunteers have done their job, staffing polling places and faithfully counting and often recounting votes. The states have done their job by certifying the election results. Now, Mr. President, I've heard the proponents of these objections raise questions about whether the various states conducted their elections properly. When disputes over elections arise, candidates are able to appeal to our legal system, not Congress, for recourse. In the 2 months since the 2020 election, the president's lawyers and allies have had the opportunity to make their arguments and challenge election results before the courts. Notably, every one of nearly 60 lawsuits that they brought forward have been rejected. In fact, the Supreme Court has twice refused to hear their election challenges. Mr. President, we must abide by these rulings. The time has now come for Congress to do its job. We should affirm the certified results of each state by counting the votes of their electors. Mr. President, altering the results of the Electoral College would set a terrible precedent in which the party in control of Congress could override the will of the voters and overrule our courts to unilaterally choose the next president. One senator attempted such a maneuver after the election in 2004, and the Senate overwhelmingly rejected that effort. The Senate has demonstrated by its vote tonight that it will follow that precedent and do so again. Tonight, Mr. President, I will continue to vote to reaffirm the foundation of our democracy, the Constitution of the United States, and I will reject these challenges to the Electoral College. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
The senator from Oregon is recognized.
Mr. President.
I invite all of my colleagues to cast your eyes upon these three boxes sitting on the table in front of the dais. These three boxes contain the certified results from every state in our union regarding how that state voted, how their electors have voted for the President of the United States of America. You know, you cast your eyes on these three boxes, and you know that there's something special. You see that there are straps on them holding the top on and straps around the side, and they're engraved, beautiful handle, beautiful leather work, crafted in the cabinet shop of our very Senate. To say to the world that their cargo is precious. Now, there's three of these boxes. The third box is brand new. It was crafted because so many states were celebrating this process that they started to use very large forms, very large envelopes, very large seals to put those ballots into, and thus a third box was needed. These boxes contain the voice of the American people weighing in as they have election after election after election. They've been used, these two smaller boxes in the last 14 elections. They carry a voice. They are transported through those doors to the House of Representatives, where the Senate and House gather to witness the opening of the envelopes to determine who will be the President of the United States. It is our constitutional responsibility to witness the counting. That is what the Constitution calls for. Tonight, when this Senate chamber was under attack by domestic terrorists, we were held here in this room, doors locked, to protect us with the help of the Capitol. police. They did an excellent job, and then they escorted us to a safe room. And that announcement came quickly. And when that announcement came, our senior assistant parliamentarian Lee Hildebrand organized the team to rescue these boxes and keep them safe. Now, thank you to her and the entire team that rescued the voice of the American people. Had they not done so, then the hooligans outside disrespecting the Constitution would have come in here and open these boxes and burned the ballots, destroying the voice of the people symbolically. And I know no one in this chamber wanted something like that to happen. Because we're here defend the Constitution, to defend the integrity of the election process, not to allow it to be destroyed. But colleagues, although we are 100 senators or 99 actually now, because there's only 99. Of us who are duly elected at the moment, 99 senators united across party defending these ballots from the hooligans out. Side, there's more than one way these ballots can be destroyed. And that is for this chamber and the House chamber to vote that one of those envelopes representing the state will be shredded, will be burned, that those votes will be discounted. We just held a vote on whether or not the envelope containing the electoral votes from Arizona should be burned. We defended these ballots against the hooligans outside. But there are those in this chamber supporting the destruction of the voice of the citizens of Arizona. 6 voted. And we are coming back later tonight to vote on whether to shred or burn the ballots for the people of Pennsylvania. So we have to stand together to say absolutely not. The constitutional responsibility is for us to defend the process, not to proceed.
But
to destroy these ballots.
Pauses for that moment. And thanks among themselves. That we can disagree with one another, but not. Not dislike each other. We can respect the voices of others. There's many times we debate on this body, and we should. There's many times we can get heated. I still consider Steny Hoyer a very good friend. There's times I get upset. I'll call him at home. To express with things I may not see fair, are just. But that's the way we should handle things. The majority leader is right. We are all Americans first. But should we also think for a moment, what do we put on social media? What do we convey to one another? Just because you have a personal opinion different than mine, you have a right to say it, but nobody has a right to become a mob. And we all should stand united in condemning the mob together.
Yeah.
We solve problems before our nation not through destruction, but through debate. That is the heart of this democracy. I know what we debate today is tough, but it's just, it's right. This isn't the first side of the aisle that's ever debated this issue. I thought what Madam Speaker said back in 2005, this is democracy at its best, when they talked about a presidential election in Ohio. These are the moments that we should raise the issue about integrity and accountability and accuracy in our elections. But you know what we should do, the next difference? Not just raise the issue, but work together to solve the problems. Now is the moment. Now is the moment to show America we can work best together. I will tell you, the size of the majority is slim, so it gives us the opportunity to make that happen. The only thing that can hold us back is the will of one another to do it. This side of the aisle always believes in working with anybody who wants to move it forward. That does not mean that we're going to agree 100% of the time. That does not mean our voice cannot be heard. That does not mean we cannot be treated fairly. We should be. That may mean on the size of committees. That means on our ability to offer an amendment. That means on our ability to have our voice. But at the end of the day, it helps us come to a better conclusion. By returning here to complete the work we were sent to do, we are proving that our democracy cannot be disrupted by criminal behavior. We will not falter, we will not bend, and we will not shrink from our duty. Let me be very clear. Mobs don't rule America. Laws rule America. It was true when our cities were burning this summer, and it's true now. When Americans go to bed tonight, their lasting memory should not be a Congress overrun by rioters. It must be a resolute Congress conducting healthy debate. We may not disagree on a lot in America, but tonight we must show the world that we will respectfully but thoroughly carry out the most basic duties of democracy. We will continue with the task that we have been sent here to do. We will follow the Constitution and the law and the process for hearing valid concerns about election integrity. We'll do it with respect. We will respect your opinion. We'll respect what you say, and we're willing to listen to it. I think the nation will be better for it on both sides of the aisle. Let's show the country the mob did not win. We have a job to do it. Let's do it with pride and let's be better when the sun rises tomorrow. With that, I yield back, Madam Speaker.
Of the 2020 election without specific allegations and, more importantly, without any proof. Our colleagues are asking us not to abide by the will of the people, but to bend to the will of one man, Donald Trump. In 1787, delegates from the 13 colonies convened in Philadelphia to debate the future of what would become the United States of America. Our founders disagreed on a lot of things. But you know, they all agreed on one thing for sure. They did not want a king. They did not want a monarch. Many of them had been there, done that. They didn't want to see it and feel it again. And they set up this intricate system of checks and balances to ensure that we would never have that all-powerful king in this country. That system of checks and balances is being pushed to a dangerous limit here today. But that system will prevail. Along with it, our democracy. Here are just some of the claims that Donald Trump and his legal team have made, and that our colleagues lend credence to here today. That Venezuela, Cuba, and China rigged our country's voting machines in favor of Joe Biden. That dead people voted in this election, and they only voted for Joe Biden. That poll watchers and election observers who risked their lives during this pandemic to uphold the integrity of our elections, that stuffed ballot boxes with Biden votes and then they shredded Trump votes. Not one, let me repeat, not one of these things is true. There is no evidence to back up these ridiculous claims. Many of these absurd claims from Donald Trump and his legal team are nothing more than conspiracy theories circulating online. This misinformation and dangerous rhetoric from the president and his allies, including calls for violence, have polluted our discourse and imperiled our peaceful transfer of power. And when our colleagues show indifference or outright support for these unsubstantiated claims and conspiracy theories, they lead our nation and our Constitution down a dangerous, dangerous path. All of us who serve here swore an oath to support and defend our Constitution. I swore that same oath as a naval flight officer many times, as a midshipman before that. But all of us here have sworn to support and defend our Constitution, not our political party, and certainly not any individual candidate. Colleagues, for the safety of our citizens and our republic, we must lead by example. We must turn the temperature down. It was a hard-fought campaign, but the campaign is over. The votes have been counted. The count has been certified in all 50 states. And in 2 weeks, on January 20th, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will be sworn in as President and Vice President of the United States, as they should be. We have serious and urgent challenges that will require working together with our new president, our new vice president, with one another in this chamber, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, and with our colleagues over in the House of Representatives. What's on our to-do list? Well, we can start with making sure that hundreds of millions of Americans get vaccinated. That we get off the dime and start vaccinating. We vaccinated 4 million people last month. 4 million. We're supposed to vaccinate 20. How are we ever going to get to 250 million at this rate? What else is on our to-do list? We're getting our kids back to school. We got kids that are unable to get on the internet, unable to participate in their classes, may not have any adult supervision at home. They're struggling, they're falling even further behind. We need to do something to help them. What else is on our to-do list? Getting their parents back to work, just to name a few things. Think of all the millions of people who lost jobs and they don't have skills anymore to fill the jobs that are needed. They need our help. They need to be retooled and retrained. It's time to stop trying to overturn the will of the people and get back to working on their behalf. Mr. President, Abraham Lincoln has been quoted a couple times here tonight, but he observed at the end of the Gettysburg Address that ours is, quote, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Even in the midst of his Civil War, President Lincoln put his unwavering faith in the people to chart our nation's course. We would be wise to remember Lincoln's words at this moment, at this special moment in our nation's history. We're not a government of Trump, by Trump, and for Trump. We're a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the people have spoken. The people have spoken. Our job here today is to listen to them. I intend to do that. And I trust that my colleagues will join me in doing that as well. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator is recognized.
Mr. President, first I want to thank all of the first responders who helped to protect this sacred chamber today, protect those Electoral College ballots. Today is a special day. On a day when some 2,500 or more Americans will lose their lives to the coronavirus, when another 130,000 will be hospitalized with it, when hundreds of small businesses will close their doors and put thousands of Americans out of work. On this day, the United States Senate is not debating how to get more life-saving vaccines into Americans' arms or how to put 2,000 badly needed dollars into their pockets. No, instead, we are using the first days of the new Senate and Congress to give time to our radical Republican colleagues' baseless and damaging claims of election fraud, all in an attempt to keep Donald Trump in office in violation of the United States Constitution. There's a word for this. It's called sedition. All these unfounded objections to state electors are seditious. They are nothing short of an insurrection against the established order
in the face of that contempt for the rule of law and disrespect for the law enforcers. So we could have seen today coming. In fact, we did. I warned about it, others did, because the fantasies and falsehoods that drove those rioters, not protesters, the mob who assaulted the Temple of Democracy, were fueled by the president's misstatements and lies and contempt for the truth. And he was enabled. He had enablers. So today we are stopping in one instance that enabling. But we must also make sure to stop it going forward. And the political stunt that brought us here today offers no great solace that it will. These stunts have consequences. We say words have consequences. And the actions today will have significant consequences. They are an attack on our democracy that undermines the core tenets of our American government and a disrespect for the will of the people and a peaceful transition of power, and the political stunts themselves driven by opportunism blaze a path that can be followed by more competent challenges, just as the dictatorial instincts and actions of this president can be followed by more effective would-be tyrants intent on destroying our republic. Yes, we have more important tasks that we should be addressing as well. The pandemic, the economic revival. But today we must be mindful of the threat to our democracy that we face down. And we come together on a bipartisan basis. But silence is never excusable in the face of lawlessness at the very top of our political structure. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Delaware is recognized.
Mr. President, I have a question for all of my colleagues this evening, which is what happened here today? And how is it different from what we expected as we assembled in this chamber early this afternoon? Sadly, much like the impeachment trial of just a year ago, I think as many of us slogged our way to the nation's capital and dutifully filed into this chamber, we expected hours and hours of debate and discussion, knowing the outcome, knowing that what was being engaged in by a handful of our colleagues was a political stunt, feeding the ego of our president, who is chasing conspiracy theories about how he actually won the election 2 months ago that he lost, and indulging his belief that somehow, the Congress could still at the last moment snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Even in the last day, President Trump had been haranguing his own incredibly loyal Vice President, Mike Pence, as if somehow Vice President Pence would simply declare him president today. We knew that President Trump had been stirring up the spirits of thousands, urging them to come to Washington. We had an inkling that he might go out and speak to them. But I don't think as we filed into this chamber, any of us expected that for the second time in our republic's history, the perimeter of this Capitol would be breached, members of the Senate would be rushed to safety, that not just the Capitol Police, but U.S. Marshals and FBI officers and fully combat-geared soldiers would be in the United States Capitol, taking it back from a riotous mob of thugs. Just a few moments ago, I went to the rotunda to see the litter and the trash, the residue and the remnants of those who took over this building today, and to say thank you to the men and women of law enforcement who helped secure it,
after it fell to an angry mob. But folks, we have to think about the consequences of what happened here today, why this happened and what it means and what it teaches. Because frankly, tonight, now, the whole world is watching. The entire world is watching a montage of scenes of folks cavorting in the Capitol, half-naked men taking that seat, scrawling things on different surfaces, parading up and down the Capitol corridors with a Confederate flag, with a Trump flag, and in other ways signaling that they had done something significant. No, in fact, what they've actually done is weakened our democracy, showed some of its fragility, and encouraged our opponents around the world. In the last 2 months since the election, we have one man who has abandoned his post, who has mostly spent his time golfing and tweeting and indulging himself in conspiracy theories and been less and less attuned to our national security and to a raging pandemic. And another man, our president-elect, who is preparing to take over the responsibility for leading this country out of this pandemic and out of its current state of deep, deep division. President Trump has abandoned his post. He does not deserve to be president any longer, and he poses a real and present threat to the future of our democracy. But let me also say this to my colleagues, half of whom changed their intended vote today after seeing what happened in the Capitol. There were, as we began, roughly 13 senators, Republicans, who said they were going to vote against the certification of the election. And when we actually finally called the roll, it was just 6. 7 of them having been chastened by the events of today. But 2 who continue on this quest, clerked for the Supreme Court Chief Justice, are deeply schooled in the law, know better than what they did today. And in the count and the debate going on over in the House, even now, more than 100 House Republicans continue with this effort. On this floor earlier today, this evening, there were strong and clear and brave speeches by Republicans and Democrats alike. So I have a question as we move forward. When will this fever break? When will we finally say to each other, enough is enough of indulging and following populism and demagoguery? Is it time to finally show who the leaders are and to uphold our Constitution that every one of the House members and a third of us swore to uphold just 3 days ago? I will tell you as I look ahead that I am confident that 2 weeks from now, Joseph Biden will be sworn in as the next president, Kamala Harris sworn in as the next vice president, and we have a unique moment in my lifetime. Because as presidents and leaders in the Senate of both parties over the last decades have observed, the Senate has steadily shrunk in its significance, its role, and its power, and the presidency has steadily grown. Not in my lifetime, not since LBJ, have we had an incoming president who spent 36 years in this chamber. We have a chance with Joe Biden, a president-elect who ran on bringing our country together, a president-elect who ran on turning the page from our moment of national division, a president-elect who respects and honors and understands the significance of this body. So we have to take this opportunity to heal, to hear each other, to compromise, to work together, and to see the real challenges facing the American people and take this last, best moment. What happened here today should leave all of us gravely concerned about the health and the future of our democracy, and the opportunity we will have 2 weeks from today is one we should not let pass us by. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. President, more than 350,000 of our loved ones have died from a terrible disease. Small businesses have gone under, never to reopen. Millions have lost their jobs, and too many families don't know how they're going to pay the rent or put groceries on the table. It is tough out there, but Americans are fighters, And despite all the challenges, in November, they did what Americans do when they are unhappy with their leadership. They voted for change. They turned their backs on a sitting president who fans the flames of hatred while bodies pile up in the morgue. Instead, they elected a new president who wants to save lives, to save our economy, and to save our democracy. Even as the pandemic raged, Americans showed up for democracy. States worked overtime to set up safe systems, ballot drop boxes and early voting, and gallons of hand sanitizer. Voters mailed their ballots earlier, put on masks, and stood in line at the polls. The election of 2020 shattered voting records. So here we are, on the floor of the United States Senate in the aftermath of an historic election held in the middle of a pandemic. People are suffering, and we should be working to get them the help they need. Instead, we are here because Donald Trump wants to overturn the results of that election. The Republicans objecting to the results of this election will be judged by history. But the rest of us will be judged as well. It is our responsibility to stand up for our democracy, even while other senators work to undermine it. Losing is hard. I ran for president myself. It was a hard-fought primary, but Joe Biden won and I lost. I am not the only one to live through that. A number of senators in this room have run for president. None of us was successful. And when we lost, we conceded and we got out of the race, because that is how democracy works. None of us lied about the results. We didn't throw temper tantrums. We didn't tell our allies in Congress or the states to overturn the results. We didn't feed poisonous propaganda to our supporters. We didn't urge people to march on state capitals or to descend on Washington. We accepted the will of the voters. And it's not just us. It's everyone who has run for president since the beginning of America. Only once in America's history have the people who lost tried to burn down our democracy on the way out. They caused a civil war that nearly destroyed our nation. Make no mistake, the violence we witnessed in this chamber today was the direct result of the poisonous lies that Donald Trump repeated again and again for more than 2 months. His words have consequences. Our democracy has been grievously injured by this lying coward. This effort to subvert our democracy is not merely one last presidential tantrum. This effort is designed to knock out the basic pillar on which democracy is founded, the idea that the voters, not the sitting president and not the members of Congress, but the voters decide who will lead this nation. A democracy in which the elected leaders do not bend to the will of the voters is no democracy. It is a totalitarian state. And those who pursue this effort are supporting a coup. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this effort to overthrow our democracy. I yield, Mr. President.
The senator from Alaska is recognized.
Ask that the Senate stand in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection.
the results coming in right now from the Senate hearings. My name is Alex Caldwell, and I am with
Blake Marnell.
And we've had a lot going on today. This has been a very, very busy day for everybody in D.C. A lot of things that I don't think anybody really expected to happen. And Blake, you were there for a lot of it. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, all I can say is, and I could go into great detail, I don't think this was the appropriate time to do it, but I'll give the quick version. Is I was part of the team with you. We were on the east side of the Capitol, which is the side of the Supreme Court is on. And there was a event there scheduled by Stop the Steal organization to start at 1 o'clock with a slate of speakers and a small stage, but an important message still. And the access to that was blocked off. And in retrospect, basically the Constitution Avenue had some roadblocks. It was, people were unable to get to it by walking up. And I think that may have had something to do with the security measures for Vice President Pence being in the Senate at that time. They needed more of those intersections open. And when it became apparent that that 1 o'clock event was not going to start, our team was called back to our studio here, and on the process, while we were walking back, we crossed in front of the Capitol, and that's when I saw that people had advanced towards the Capitol steps. I knew we had one team down there. I went to try and find them. I wasn't able to, and by the time I made it up towards the Capitol, at that time I had seen nothing that was violent. I hadn't seen anything that really was overtly. There was confrontation, certainly. There was a lot of yelling. There was some shoving, but I didn't see. I smelled some spray in the air, whether that was tear gas from the police or somebody with bear spray, impossible to know. But there was some sort of irritant in the air. But there was no actual violence happening at that time. So at that time, I considered it still to be a protest, a peaceful one, confrontational, but peaceful. And as we know, it didn't stay that way. And I think that I would like to say that I support the vast majority of President Trump supporters are not violent. They're not. I've been around them at rallies. I've been around them on the streets of Washington. This is the third time in the last couple of months. And I think that what we saw today is an aberration from a minority of people who support President Trump, claim to support President Trump, or don't support President Trump, but successfully blended in with President Trump supporters. I can't condone any violence. I think the answer going forward certainly doesn't involve any type of violent protest. People are upset. We haven't even talked about it right now, but it appears that I think we need to accept the fact that President Trump will not be our next president, that Joe Biden will be inaugurated on the 20th. That appears to be the direction the joint session is going in now. I certainly didn't want it to turn out this way. I'm sure you didn't either.
No, I didn't. And I will say I was very disappointed to see what ended up happening with all of it. I had thought, there's a good possibility that the Senate argues it goes to the House, and then Pence casts out the electors, and boom, Trump wins another 4 years. And it had been hyped up, I believe, by a lot of people, and I had believed that there was a good chance that he could end up pulling it off, but it does not look like that is what is going to happen anymore, with a lot of these senators who had stated that they would argue for President Trump, that they would object to results, such as Kelly Loeffler or Marsha Blackburn, James Lankford, all of these senators who had previously pledged their support for the president, saying that they would object to the Electoral College results in these 6 swing states of Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia. They have since reversed their decision, which I wasn't really expecting that. But I do agree with you. I think that we do, as painful as it is to admit, I think we need to accept the fact that, unfortunately, the president will not be the leader come January 20th. It will be Joe Biden, he will become the next president of the United States.
Yes, I agree with you absolutely. Besides the path that you mentioned, there was another path that was possible. Had the 10-day period proposed by Senator Cruz and the commission to examine the election, had that passed, that would have given a window of time for state legislatures to reconvene and voluntarily either A, decertify the Biden electoral slates or certify the Trump electoral slates to create competing electors, which would then have to be resolved. So that was a possibility. It's interesting to say that many people are going to say, I told you so, there never was a path, there never was a way. The truth is, there still were several. At this point, I don't see there as being any.
I completely agree with you, and you are correct. There were many cases, the Texas case, and you had today as well a lot of states that try to decertify in the state legislature, and they still might try to do that, but I still believe that the odds of them actually being successful in that and in all of those states that the president would need, it is a long shot. And I feel like I would be lying if I said that he was going to end up pulling it off in the end, and I just don't see how he can. But even though he won't be president, he has had more of an impact on us and on this country more than any other president in modern history. 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, I could say, in 2015, he came down that escalator in Trump Tower and he announced his candidacy, and nobody thought he was going to win. Everybody viewed him as a laughingstock, but he was an outsider. And he brought attention to issues that we never thought really mattered. We had never really considered the swamp and what they do. No. And he brought light to that. And he showed us just how deep the swamp really was and what it really was. And he really opened a lot of our eyes. And while he might not be president, I still think he can do a lot from the outside. He has said he's not going to go away. Come 2022, he's going to be out there campaigning for the midterms. He's not a huge fan of Brian Kemp. He's not a huge fan of John Thune, senator from South Dakota. And he has said he's going to campaign against them. He even announced on his Georgia rally in Dalton, Georgia, that he was going to campaign against Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia. Mm-hmm. So the president is still going to be out there, and he's still going to be campaigning. He is still going to try to reform the Republican Party. And while the Republican Party may be filled with these rhinos, the people that we consider to be the Mitt Romneys of the Republican Party, while they still might be full of that, the president is going to do his best over the coming years to help reform the party and reshape the party to be a party of America first. And you and I were talking earlier about what America first really is, and the whole stimulus package that they did pass is not an America first stimulus package. It was an America last stimulus package, giving tens of billions of dollars to foreign countries and only $600 to Americans. And they even gave themselves raises in Congress. They got more money than we got.
Yeah, and I think we should say, I believe that America First will be the lasting contribution from the Trump presidency. There's so many things that he did that were effective and beneficial for our country. And if we talk about peace agreements, there's still things that are coming that may come up in the next few weeks. But I don't think we should really be, we're not going to go recap all of the accomplishments of his administration. But I agree with you that he will be active on the campaign scene. And personally, I think it'll be interesting to see if on the day before Joe Biden is inaugurated, I wouldn't be surprised if President Trump announced his candidacy for 2024. It has some beneficial avenues for him. He basically would never go back to being a private citizen. His social media accounts wouldn't be at risk of being censored that way. He would essentially go from being the president to a candidate for president in 2024. And I fully support the president still. I believe that having seen firsthand what happened on the west side of the Capitol, I didn't see what happened on the east. I can tell you that it was peaceful for the most part. There were a few people that were agitating, and that did not start until later when they started to hit the windows. That was not the first thing that happened when they came up there. And it's going to be extremely unfair that out of the 75 million people that voted for President Trump, they will probably all be called rioters and terrorists. And it's not true. It's such a fractionally small section of people that it's not really, it's so tiny. And yet that label will be applied to all of us. Unfortunately, I feel there will be a wave of political canceling. And the Republican Party going forward, I don't believe is non-salvageable. I think that we all know what we need to do. It doesn't involve further violent protests. It involves us becoming involved in our Republican parties at the local level and putting our input there to make sure our voices are heard. I think that's something that we need to be doing.
I think you're exactly right, Blake. And on to that point you were making about all of the protests that were going on today, I'd say about 95% of the protests that were going on were peaceful, maybe even more than 95%. As we're walking through Washington, D.C., we've seen people praying, we've seen people singing, we've seen people bonding and meeting other people, and it's been a really friendly environment here. And what happened today at the Capitol was not what 95% of this protest was. 95% of this protest was peaceful. There were people who were celebrating, people who were so happy to see their president. And one of the interesting things that I thought was very neat was on my plane ride here, I took off. Chicago as one of my connecting flights, and I'm on the airplane from Chicago, and most of the airplane is filled with Trump supporters in Chicago, one of the most liberal cities in the country. I mean, we've had people coming from all around to see him, see the president. There has been a lot of support for him here, and it is a shame that a lot of these people are going to automatically be told that they are rioters, that they are violent people, and it's really a shame.
And I think it's also fair. I would like to see the Senate take some criticism. I know that people were characterizing what happened here, that they're rioters, they're terrorists, they're domestic terrorists, and yet the same type of actions that we saw in protests earlier this year didn't necessarily get that type of classification. I mean, if you were attacking federal buildings in the city of Portland, Oregon, for instance, over an 80-day period, that didn't qualify you for being a terrorist. That didn't qualify you for being a rioter. You were merely a protester. I think that people will see the dichotomy about that. There's obviously a lot of tragedy that happened today. There was a loss of life, and I think that that does not take away from the fact that the same type of actions were not labeled that way earlier this year. I would like to see some equity in that. I would also like to see the senators who perceived that there was some form of injustice in the way the states had cast their ballots, the way the electoral votes had been made, that they were going to support the 10-day commission to investigate it. And then after the events of today, no longer support it. So to me, that seems like, well, we think there's something wrong here. There's a crime, possibly, something that needs to be investigated against, but now we don't feel like we want to investigate it because of what happened today. And that doesn't seem like following the rule of law. That seems like taking something personally and deciding to no longer go through with what you had previously announced you would do based upon your legal analysis.
I think you're exactly correct. And I think that will shape how the Senate is going to end up looking in the next several years to come throughout these coming elections, whether or not you'll have a lot of these incumbents who didn't support the president be primaried out. Maybe they decide to resign. But either way, they're not going to have the support that they once had when a majority of these Trump supporters believe the president when the president says that there was fraud in this election. And the president's claims that there were fraud in the election, I believe, are going to cause a lot of these conservatives to vote out their incumbents.
Yes, and I think there's definitely room for calling for improvement in the mechanism by which ballots are counted, by which recounts are done. I think people, once they've taken a look under some of the voting machines, are not really happy with the processes there. Maybe they're not as trustworthy as they thought. I mean, honestly, I didn't know that much about voting machines before. I figured you vote, there's a paper ballot, there's a recount, you go back to the paper ballots. Apparently that's not the way it is. And I think that people would like some more confidence in their voting systems. And I think that that's not even a partisan issue. Making elections fair and removing doubt from them shouldn't be a partisan issue. And I think we'll definitely see that.
I completely agree with you, Blake. And I think one of the things that we have to do right now as Americans is try to pray and hope that our country really can heal and unite. Because I think if we've learned anything from these past several weeks since the election, is that our country is very much divided. I mean, we're walking through the street and we are walking through Black Lives Matter Plaza, and we see a lot of anti-Trump liberal stuff out there. And then you walk through the rest of DC and you see a lot of conservatives, and you see people storming into the Capitol. I mean, there are a lot of people on both sides who just don't like each other very much. And I think that one of the things we need more than anything right now is peace. I think we need God, and I think we need unity. And I'm hoping that someday, and I don't know when it will be, but I'm hoping that that will happen to us someday. And I'm also hoping that while I do not believe he is going to do a good job whatsoever, I'm hoping that Joe Biden does a good job while he's president. I don't think he will.
Why would we want something bad to happen to America with our leader?
If he does well, our country does well. I don't think he will, but I pray that he does, and I pray that our country can succeed with him.
Yeah, and another thing I might add is that many of us will be hearing calls for forming a third party, whether it's a Patriot Party or a Lion Party. Good idea. I think we need to, as conservatives, reform our party from within, much as we saw in a really large class of freshman representatives in the House of Representatives come in this last election. And as we move forward, there's a lot of ways we can look back at the last election season. There's a lot of what ifs, an incredible amount of what ifs. But I think the time for those is over. To look at the what's next. And I believe that the what next, the first one on the list, is no more violent protests. If you're going to protest, absolutely do it. But do it nonviolently.
I completely agree. Remember, we, the Republicans, are the party of nonviolence. We are the party of back the blue. We cannot attack police officers. We cannot act violent towards them. And we cannot act violently towards anybody. That's how we're supposed to act in our country, and I think that that's how we need to continue to act. With what our politicians have to say. Republicans or Democrats, while we might despise them, we think everything they stand for is wrong, the one thing that we can do is we can peacefully protest and we can vote them out. We are in charge of them. We can fire them if we want to, but we have to do it legally and we have to do it peacefully.
Yes, and I think that many Trump supporters are very vocal about their support. I think you should be ready to unfortunately, I think in today's cancel culture, you should be ready for blowback against your political beliefs. That doesn't mean it's right. By supporting President Trump, you certainly didn't support vandalism in the Capitol and people entering it illegally and committing mayhem inside. So, I don't know. I think really, I think it's just time to sign off.
I agree, Blake. I would just like to thank each and every one of you for watching us over the years. We will not be going away. There are always things that are coming up. So we appreciate all of the support that you guys have given us since day one, since this company has covered every single President Trump rally. We have not missed a single one because we are loyal to him. We want to hear what he has to say because Nobody else is going to report to him what he is actually saying. We're not going to make it biased. We're going to show you exactly what he's saying. We're not going to edit it. And we just appreciate all of the support that you guys have given us over the years. And remember, you guys will want to hear updates from Right Side Broadcasting so that you can figure out what we're doing, where we're going to be, if we're going to even be near you. So remember, you can follow us on Instagram at RSB Network, and you can follow us on our Twitter at RSB Network. So I encourage you all, please, 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 if you have not already followed us on our social media platforms, please do so right now. That is RSB Network for both Twitter and Instagram, and hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube and stay up to date with all of the videos that we will be posting so that you get notifications as well.
So from a long, eventful, and historical January 6th here in Washington, D.C., I'd like to say goodnight to you all. Be safe and continue to support our country.